Hello, everyone. This is Mike Wilkerson, the founder of Stormwall Advisors, the host of Stormwall.com, and the author of the book, Why America Matters. I wanted to come back to you today to continue to talk about the ongoing banking and financial crisis looming around us. Today, I have an interesting and provocative question for you. So what happens exactly when one zombie eats another? Well, there's an application here, which is all the disgusting and fetid zombie parts of the consumed of the eaten simply move to the consumer. And the same thing is true of zombie banks. So when one zombie bank, full of death and corruption, but better hidden due to superior cosmetics, eats its more visibly ill and compatriot zombie bank, the underlying rot is still there. We haven't made the world a safer place. And of course, I'm talking about the forced merger between UBS, Union Bank of Switzerland, and its agreed acquisition of Credit Suisse in a take-under transaction that valued the equity of Credit Suisse at $3.3 billion US dollars equivalent, a more than 60% discount to Credit Suisse's closing price last Friday. And interestingly, while most of their equity value was wiped out, equity holders are getting something, shareholders are getting something, whereas $16 billion of Credit Suisse's AT1 bonds, which are basically bail-in bonds, will be written off to zero. So I'm not sure why shareholders would receive anything, let alone $3.3 billion of consideration, when most of the more senior creditors are taking a goose egg. But that is the announced deal, and we'll see what happens there as litigation is likely to ensue. Now, UBS noted that it's going to achieve about $8 billion in annualized cost savings over the next 5 years. This implicitly represents somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 jobs, primarily, presumably, at Credit Suisse, which will add to the wave of mass layoffs already impacting the global investment banking sector so far in 2023. It's fair to say that this was not a happy union, but rather a shotgun marriage arranged by the Swiss government and the central bank. Credit Suisse, once the flagship and crown jewel of the Swiss financial economy, was desperate, laden with losses and bad loans, undercapitalized and unable to fund itself. Credit Suisse was on the verge of failing outright. Now, this would have been an absolutely devastating outcome, not just for Credit Suisse, but it could have triggered really a global financial markets crisis or meltdown, even worse than what was seen in 2008. The only alternative to an acquirer's rescue or bankruptcy was the idea of nationalization, which was very unpalatable to the Swiss government officials and taxpayers alike. So UBS was dragged kicking and screaming to the altar. Now, one interesting aspect of this transaction was that in violation of securities laws, or at least the customary shareholder prerogatives, the Swiss government determined that no shareholder group, neither UBS nor Credit Suisse, will be able to exercise their rights to vote on the transaction. So in other words, the merger is basically a done deal. Other than, save for some procedural steps to closing, UBS was, however, able to secure a number of concessions from the Swiss government, including a loss guarantee of up to $9 billion, more than 3 times what UBS is paying for the equity of Credit Suisse. But more importantly, the combined group can now access over $200 billion equivalent of financial assistance from the Swiss National Bank, half of which comes with the guarantee from the Swiss federal government in the event of default. So translating this, even though UBS is issuing some $3.3 billion of its own shares to acquire Credit Suisse, it's the Swiss government that is bearing much of the risk, and Swiss taxpayers who will ultimately pick up the tab if things go wrong. So UBS shareholders, on the other hand, are now the owners of the mess. Their management will have to sort it through, but those shareholders will see their investment value diluted potentially in 3 new ways. 1, by the share issuance. 2, by any unsustained negative market reaction to the deal. For example, this morning at market open, the UBS's share prices were initially down about 8%, although we covered much of that on the news. And of course, by future losses at Credit Suisse, should they exceed the guarantee. But most of that is not really the main point. The main point here, the real issue, is that the underlying problems at Credit Suisse, including the toxic assets, gross mismanagement, hidden losses, and unrealized counterparty exposure, have not been isolated as a result of the transaction. Those risks are simply now transferred from one to another too big to fail bank, where Credit Suisse's and UBS's risk assets will now be more heavily concentrated. And thus the consequences of a misstep by UBS management will be even more severe. So this is a form of a shuffling of the deck chairs as opposed to something substantive and fundamental changing. And the financial system remains as vulnerable as it was before. And we shouldn't forget that UBS was itself bailed out in 2008 by the Swiss government. The government did make back its money on this, on that investment. UBS has been profitable, very profitable recently. It's better managed, but it has been plagued with problems ever since, including fines in the EU, in the US, multiple jurisdictions, problems in the investment bank, et cetera. So in a weird way, the merger is a little bit of akin to the proverbial two drunks holding each other up as they try to walk down the street or stumble down the street. And yet, unfortunately, here, one of them still holds the keys to the car. And UBS management are now, I think, in a position of having bitten off way more than they can chew, and they probably know it. They had little choice given the overweening government and regulatory pressure brought to bear on them over the past several days. Now, the market reaction has been mixed. I mentioned that UBS's share price is down, but I think more tellingly, the market believes that the merger is increasing riskiness at UBS. And you can see this in the cost of the CDS, the cost of insuring against a credit default at UBS. This has increased by over 50% since last Wednesday, when rumors of the merger first started to emerge. So this reflects both merger-specific concerns, but also just generalized fear of financial contagion and widening crisis in the banking sector generally. Now, at the same time, while not officially a nationalization, the Swiss government and thus its taxpayers have assumed the ultimate financial responsibility of the combined entity, for better or for worse. So following the merger announcement within a few hours and anticipating, in anticipation of an increase in market distress, the Swiss National Bank, along with the US's Federal Reserve and 5 other central banks, including the ECB, et cetera, announced late on Sunday night a plan to enhance market liquidity by opening up daily swap lines to clear US dollar transactions. Now, what does this really mean? It means that there's a clear sense of panic and an indication that the regulators, the central bankers, do not believe that the financial markets are functioning, that they're stable in a way that they should be, and they need to do everything they can to provide adequate liquidity on a daily basis for something that they would normally have done once a week. So the coming days are going to test probably severely whether the past week's combined regulatory and central bank actions will be sufficient to calm the markets. In conclusion, I'd say that UBS's acquisition of Credit Suisse was a necessary but not a sufficient condition to address the particular element, this particular corner of distress in the global financial markets. Yet nothing has essentially changed, and the risk of a widening crisis in the banking sector remains extremely elevated. We'll see how this plays out in the coming days. I hope you found this interesting and helpful. If so, please do give it a like on YouTube. Share it with anybody else you think would be interested, and subscribe to the channel. We expect that given the volume, the speed of activity here in the financial markets, that we're going to be talking about this quite a bit over the next few days. So you definitely want to stay tuned and stay in touch. You can also check out all of my writings on this and other subjects at stormwell.com. So thank you for your time today. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.